Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, checking out the new album from LA Guns, Leopard Skin. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. Yes, you heard me right. LA Guns has released a new album. This is their 15th studio album. And they're one of those bands that I kind of long considered them one of those forgotten glam rock bands from the 80s that never really got the credit I think they deserved. LA Guns are one of those bands that I think really helped define that 1980s Sunset Strip glam rock sound, along with bands like Rat, Poison, Warrant you could throw in there also. Guns N' Roses, of course, was probably the biggest one to come out of that group. And even though LA Guns never reached the popularity of some of those other bands, I think they were releasing music that was equally as good. They're also a band that I think had a little bit more of a complicated history than a lot of the other ones from around that time. So the band was started back in 1983 by Tracii Guns and drummer Rob Gardner. Then in 1985 they would merge with Hollywood Rose to create Guns N' Roses, but it didn't last very long before Tracii Guns would leave Guns N' Roses and reform LA Guns. And it was shortly after that that Phil Lewis would leave Girls and join LA Guns as their lead singer. And then in 1987, Steve Riley would leave Wasp and join the band as their drummer, and Steve would be the band's most consistent member until his death in 2023. And over the years, it would have this almost revolving door of members, but it was mainly just Tracii Guns, Steve Riley, and Phil Lewis was the core members of that band. I think LA Guns was kind of a victim of timing also. So in 1988, they would release their self-titled debut album, and that was with Nicky Alexander on drums. So that's before Steve Riley joined the band. Steve actually joined the band right before the album was released, but commercially it did really well. It would go on to hit number 50 on the Billboard 200 and eventually become a gold album. And then a year later, they would release their sophomore album, Cocked and Loaded. And same thing. It would be, commercially it did really well, hit number 30 on Billboard 200, and it would also go gold. And then by the time they would release their third album, Hollywood Vampires, in 1991, rock music was definitely changing. And even though it charted well, I think it was like number 42 or 43 on the Billboard 200, rock music was already kind of transitioning away from that 80s glam rock sound. So even though it charted well, I think commercially it was still kind of seen as a disappointment, especially compared to those first couple of albums. But overall, I think the quality was definitely there on that third album. Like I said, I think just rock music fans had moved on to something else. Those three albums, I don't think the band would ever really kind of recapture the magic that they had on that early period. And after Cocked and Loaded came out, that's when the band really started going through a lot of changes. Phil Lewis would record one more album with the band, which is Vicious Circle, which I think is a really underrated album. And then he would leave the band after the release of that. I think that album came out in 1995. He would come back and rejoin the band in 99 and then stay a permanent member after that. And then eventually Tracii Guns would leave the band in 2002. And even after Tracii left in 2002, they would release a couple more albums. I think it was 2005 and 2012. And those albums, I give them a lot of credit for kind of sticking with that earlier sound. Yes, they would incorporate some like 90s alternative in there, but whenever you listen to one of their albums, it always kind of had that 1980s glam rock sound to it. And as someone that grew up in the 80s, I know glam rock gets a lot of heat and a lot of hate from music fans out there, but I think looking back on that genre, 40 years later, I don't think though a lot of those bands, yes, there were some really bad bands, but there are also some really great gems in there. And I think LA Guns was one of those bands. I think had their self-titled album come out a year or two earlier, I think they would have been an even bigger band. And their new album, Leopard Skin, this is the fifth album since the return of Tracii Guns in 2016. The opening track, Taste It, I believe was the lead single off the album, and it has this very nostalgic kind of sound to it. And I think it's a great primer for what to expect on the rest of this album. It was actually kind of funny. I was reading a review earlier, and it said whoever wrote the review said that the song had an almost foreigner kind of sound to it, which I don't really hear that, but I think it was a really kind of interesting comparison between that band and LA Guns. And the song has this great guitar solo in the middle of it. It has this almost like David Gilmour kind of style to it, which I've never heard Tracii Guns play like that before. So I think it really worked well. And it kind of shows his growth, I think, as a musician over the last 35 years. The second song on the album is Lucky Motherfucker, which is another single they released before the album came out. And the first time I listened to this album, I listened to the song probably 3 or 4 times because it has this really familiar kind of sound to it, but I just can't place the exact song that I think it sounds like. And something I noticed right away listening to this album, and something I really liked also, is the way that they varied the pacing and varied the style across the beginning of the album. Makes, I think, for a better overall listening experience. And then they follow up Lucky Motherfucker with The Grinder, which has this almost, the first time I listened to it, it really sounds, or it's very reminiscent of a late 80s, early 90s song from Ozzy Osbourne in both style and the vocals, at least the vocals at times on that song. And by this point in the album, they're really laying heavy into those 1980s guitar riffs, something you would expect from Tracii Guns. And as far as like at least the last several albums since his return in 2016, I think on this album it might be some of his best guitar work. And then Hit and Run is the first song to stray away from that 80s glam rock sound. I think it's one of the better songs on the album. It sounds more similar to like a 90s alternative song, which if you listen to any of the LA Guns albums from the 90s and early 2000s, that's kind of how those albums sounded. And I think that's where you could hear the evolution in the band at that point. And it's nice to hear them kind of go back and kind of blend in both the very earlier period from the band, the more like straightforward glam rock stuff, and kind of mix in some of that alternative rock sound. And then the next 2 songs I think are the 2 big misses on this album. You've got Don't Give Me Away and I'm Your Candyman. And I don't think either one of those songs are necessarily, they're not horrible songs. I think just at best, they're just kind of there, kind of taking up space on the album. Musically, they're both fine, but I'm Your Candyman, the lyrics on that song, I think are a little too corny. And glam rock songs a lot of times are okay with lyrics like that, but with the music on here just kind of being okay and those lyrics, it's one of those tracks I just have to skip over when I'm listening to it. And then Runaway Train is an interesting song on this album because it sounds like a country song. It has a very country kind of twang to the song overall. And it's an interesting contrast to the rest of the songs on this album. I think it really helps showcase the varying styles and influences in this band. Then you got a song like Follow the Money, which I think is probably the heaviest song on this album. I'm pretty sure it is the heaviest one on here. But it's also, I think, one of the catchier songs at the same time. And then it wouldn't be an 80s glam rock album without one of those token power ballads. And that's what The Masquerade is. But I think it's a beautifully written song, both musically and vocally. And as far as 80s style power ballads go, it's a really good one. I think it's one of the better songs on the album. So I always talk about track listing and how track listing is very important to me, especially the opening and closing songs on the album. So the last song on this album is If You Wanna. And I think it's probably one of the worst songs to pick. It's not a bad song. It's just an okay song, but I think it's a really bad way to wrap up the album. It does have a really good guitar solo about midway through the song. I think so it kind of gives it some kind of redeeming quality, but at best it's just kind of an okay song for me. Nothing bad, but nothing really great there either. And I could think of probably at least 2 or 3 other tracks on here that would have been a better overall closing song on this album. Look, LA Guns, they're not reinventing the wheel with this album. This is just a really good, really straightforward glam rock album. But for a band that's in their, 5th decade of playing music, I think it's probably the best you can expect. The album has its strong points. It's got a couple of weak ones also, but for a band that's been playing music for this long and has gone through so many different members, I mean, at one point, there was actually 2 different LA Guns with Steve Riley having his own version of the band, and they're actually out on tour at the same time. I'm sure it had to be confusing for fans that wanted to go see them, but to go through all the turmoil that they've gone through, to come out on the other end still creating really good music, I think it's a testament to how good this band really is. I give the band a lot of credit for sticking to this style of music where, a lot of their contemporaries, similar sounding bands in the 80s and early 90s, they kind of drifted off and kind of tried to follow music and tried to stay relevant in rock music in the 90s and early 2000s where, LA Guns were kind of trying to do their own thing and a lot of their contemporaries just kind of drifted off into obscurity. I think it's always kind of been a knock on glam rock or hair metal, whatever you want to call it, is there were a lot of fans out there, a lot of rock fans out there, that saw glam rock as not being a very authentic style of music. And there are bands like LA Guns, I think wrongly kind of got lumped into it with some of those other ones. This is one of those albums where I don't think they're going to draw in new fans, but if you're a fan of 80s glam rock or 80s hair metal, I think you'll really enjoy this one. Like I said, it does have a couple skippable tracks on there. I can do without Don't Give Me Away or I'm Your Candyman. Those 2 tracks, I think you can probably trim those off. But the rest of the album is really solid. It's got some really standout tracks on here. And they're a band that I think has released some really good songs over the last several years. Since Tracii Guns returned to the band, I don't think they've released a great album, so I didn't have super high expectations going into this one. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I was going to, though. I didn't see online who produced this album, but production-wise, I think they did a really good job with it. There's nothing like glaring that really stands out to me that I could knock the album on. And for a glam rock album being released in 2025, it's a solid album. You know, it's not going to blow anyone away. It's not going to draw in a bunch of new fans for the band. You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, I think 7 is probably a good score for it. And as for owning a physical copy of it, you know, it's an album I probably don't have to have on vinyl. I don't know if I'd listen to it enough to justify owning a copy of it. Maybe if I grab a copy of it on sale somewhere, I might. But, you know, I might pick up a copy of it on CD. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of this new album from LA Guns. You know, how would you rate it from 1 to 10? Have you listened to it? Or you got to pick up a copy of it? Glam rock was always one of those genres that, I don't know, really kind of hit or miss with me. I think it was more miss than hit. Yeah, I mean, there were some great albums, but I felt like there was a lot of junk that was thrown out there in the late 80s also. And LA Guns were one of those bands I think got lost in a lot of that. So they're one of those bands that I think if you haven't listened to in a long time, they're definitely worth revisiting, especially like the last several albums. Ever since Tracii came back, so this is the fifth album since he came back, definitely check out those albums. Like I said, I don't think they're ever going to match the magic that they had on their first, 2 or 3 albums. But for a band that's been around for over 40 years now, they're still releasing some really solid albums. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.